Nobody in Larimer Hollow, Wyoming thought much of it that first winter when 9-year-old Beckett Farrow started walking out to the old barn every single morning before breakfast, standing at the same spot along the fence line, and counting the icicles hanging from the roof's edge, one by one, writing the number down in a small notebook his grandfather had given him. Beckett had come to live with his grandfather, Roy Farrow, only 4 months earlier, after a highway accident that October took both his parents in a single terrible afternoon and left a 9-year-old boy with no home left to return to except his mother's childhood ranch in the high country outside town. Roy, 67 and suddenly raising a grandson he loved fiercely but had never expected to parent again at his age, let the icicle counting go on without much question that winter, the way he let most of Beckett's small, careful routines go on unquestioned, understanding, in the quiet, unspoken way grief sometimes teaches people, that a child working through something enormous often needs one small, controllable thing to hold on to. Neither of them knew that December, that Beckett's careful counting would end up saving considerably more than his own peace of mind before winter was through. If stories about grief, resilience, and the surprising ways a child's coping habits can carry real meaning matter to you, this is exactly the kind of story we tell every week. Go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if this story moves you, tap that like button before you go. It genuinely helps this small channel find the people who care about stories like Beckett's. Now let's find out what those icicles were really telling him, and why an old barn's survival would come down to a 9-year-old's quiet counting. Larimer Hollow sits in the high, exposed ranching country of northern Wyoming, where winters arrived early and stayed hard, and where the Farrow family had run cattle on the same 600 acres for 4 generations. Roy had taken over the operation from his own father decades earlier, and had run it largely alone since his wife Eleanor's death 8 years before this story, managing the physical demands of ranch work in his 60s with the same stubborn competence he'd always brought to it, even as the work grew steadily harder on a body that no longer recovered the way it once had. Beckett's mother, Roy's only daughter Meredith, had left Larimer Hollow at 18 for college and a life in Denver that never brought her back except for holiday visits, though she'd always kept Beckett close to his grandfather through summers spent on the ranch, weeks that Roy treasured more than he ever fully told her. When the accident took Meredith and her husband that October, on a stretch of icy highway outside Denver, Roy didn't hesitate about what came next, driving down within a day to bring his grandson home to the only extended family either of them had left. Beckett arrived at the ranch that November carrying almost nothing beyond a single suitcase and a grief too large for a 9-year-old to fully process in any way an adult could easily witness or interpret. He didn't cry often, at least not where Roy could see him, and he didn't talk much about his parents either, retreating instead into small, precise routines that Roy recognized, from his own experience grieving Eleanor, as a particular kind of coping, the mind reaching for something countable and controllable when everything else in the world had proven it could disappear without warning. The icicle counting started almost by accident, the way Roy told it afterward. Beckett had wandered out to the barn one frosty December morning, restless the way he often was before dawn, and had simply stood there a long while, staring up at the row of icicles forming along the barn's eastern roofline, catching the first week light. He came back the next morning and did the same thing, and the morning after that, until sometime in that second week he started actually counting them, then measuring their length against his own outstretched hand. Then, once Roy noticed and gave him a small spiral notebook without asking many questions, recording both numbers carefully every single day. Roy's neighbor, Dale Whitcomb, who ran cattle on the adjoining section and had known Roy his whole life, mentioned the habit to his wife one evening after stopping by to help Roy with a stuck gate. "Kid stands out there every morning counting icicles like it's a job," Dale said, not unkindly, more with the particular gentle concern people carry for a grieving child they don't quite know how to help. His wife, who'd lost her own mother young, said it sounded like exactly the kind of thing a child in Beckett's position needed, something nobody else was going to take away from him or get wrong. Roy himself didn't fully understand what the counting meant to his grandson, only that it seemed to steady something in the boy each morning, a brief, private ritual before the harder work of simply getting through another day without his parents. He made a point of never commenting on the numbers or asking Beckett to explain his notebook, treating the routine with the same careful, unquestioning respect he brought to most things about raising a grieving child he was still learning to understand. What neither of them fully grasped that December, though Roy would come to appreciate it deeply by winter's end, was how genuinely careful and consistent Beckett's counting actually was. He measured from the same fixed spot along the fence every morning, used his own outstretched hand as a rough but remarkably consistent length reference, and recorded both the total icicle count and his best estimate of the 5 or 6 longest icicles' length in inches, data that, without either of them quite realizing it, was building into a genuinely useful record of exactly how the barn roof's ice formation was changing week to week. By early January, Larimer Hollow had settled into a stretch of unusually cold, dry weather, and Beckett's count stayed relatively steady, the icicles growing slowly but predictably as the barn's minimal heat loss through the roof continued its slow, steady melt and refreeze cycle along the eaves. Beckett noted the numbers each morning without much drama, the routine settling into something almost meditative for him, a small, dependable constant in a life that had lost most of its other constants. The pattern changed sharply in the second week of February, when a series of storms brought heavy, wet snow to the region, nearly 3 feet accumulating over 8 days, followed by a brief warm spell that began melting the snowpack's surface before another hard freeze locked everything back down. Beckett's icicle counts, which had grown gradually and predictably through January, suddenly jumped dramatically during that stretch, not just in number but in length, several icicles along the barn's eastern eave growing, by his careful measurements, nearly 8 inches in a single week, a rate of change unlike anything his 2 months of prior data showed. He mentioned it to Roy at breakfast one morning, showing his grandfather the notebook with the same quiet seriousness he brought to most things since the accident. "They're growing faster," Beckett said. "A lot faster than before." Roy looked at the numbers, genuinely impressed by how carefully his grandson had tracked them, but initially considered it mostly a curiosity, the kind of thing a grieving child notices and cares about precisely because it's small and measurable in a world that otherwise felt entirely out of his control. It was Dale Whitcomb, stopping by 2 days later to borrow a tool, who looked at Beckett's notebook with something closer to real concern once Roy mentioned the boys' project, mostly out of fondness for how seriously Beckett had taken it. Dale, who'd lost a machine shed to a roof collapse himself 15 years earlier during a similarly heavy, wet snow year, explained what the accelerating icicle growth likely meant. The rapid lengthening indicated significant ongoing melt beneath the snowpack's surface, meltwater running down through the accumulated snow and refreezing at the roof's cold eaves, a pattern that meant the snow load sitting on the barn roof wasn't the light, dry snow a roof could typically handle safely, but increasingly heavy, saturated, ice-laden snow, considerably denser and heavier than an equivalent depth of fresh powder. Exactly the kind of load that had brought down his own machine shed years earlier. Roy walked out to the barn immediately with Dale, and the 2 men, examining the roofline together with considerably more urgency than either had brought to it that week, agreed the snow load looked genuinely concerning. Thick, dense drifts built up unevenly across the roof's surface, heavier by a visible margin than anything Roy remembered seeing in recent winters. They spent that entire afternoon and the following morning clearing snow from the barn roof by hand, working carefully from ladders and using long-handled roof rakes to pull the heaviest sections down before they could add further stress to a structure that had already, they realized once they got a closer look at the interior framing, been showing subtle signs of strain, a slight new sag in one of the older support beams that Roy admitted he hadn't noticed until Dale pointed it out. They finished clearing the worst of the load 2 days before another significant storm moved through the region, dropping another 1.5 feet of snow over a single night. Dale's own barn, built in a similar era and left uncleared through that same storm cycle, suffered a partial roof collapse 2 nights later, a section giving way under the combined weight of old snow, new snow, and ice exactly the way his machine shed had years earlier. Roy and Beckett's barn, cleared just in time, held. Dale came by that following week, once his own damage had been assessed and partially repaired, and stood at Roy's cleared barn roofline for a long moment before saying much of anything. "That boy's icicle counting probably saved your whole herd's shelter," he said finally. Roy didn't disagree. Word moved through Larimer Hollow's small ranching community the way these things did, and by the following winter 2 other ranching families had started their own informal icicle and snow load monitoring, inspired directly by Beckett's notebook, checking their own barn eaves each morning the way the boy had, almost without meaning to, taught an entire hollow to pay attention to. Beckett never made much of what happened that February. When people asked how he'd known something was different, he usually gave some version of the same quiet answer. He hadn't known anything about roofs or snow load. He'd just noticed the icicles were growing faster than they had been, and once he noticed, he couldn't stop paying attention to it, the same way he couldn't quite stop counting most mornings that whole hard first winter. There is a particular kind of attention that grief sometimes builds in a person, a need to hold onto something small and countable when everything larger has proven it can be lost without warning. Becket Farrow hadn't set out to save his grandfather's barn or teach a neighbor anything about snow load. He'd simply needed one quiet, dependable routine to carry him through the hardest winter of his young life, and intending that routine faithfully, morning after morning, without anyone asking him to, he noticed something real that an entire ranching community would end up grateful he'd never stopped counting.